Good evening and welcome to Council Chambers here in Southbridge. This is a joint meeting of the Southbridge Town Council and the Planning Board. It is Wednesday, June 20th, and it is about 6:40 p.m. And I'll ask if we could all say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. I see we have recording clerk. Will you be doing a roll call for us? Ready? Would you like to do a roll call for us?
Councillor Auclair, Councillor Carrasco, Councillor Clements,
Present.
Councillor DePietro, Councillor Manna, Councillor Morales, present. Councillor Nash, present. Councillor Steve, present. 5 present.
And just for notations, Councillor Manna is delayed. Councillor Carrasco sent an email that he'd be unavailable for meetings from June 14th to June 26th, and I believe Councillor DePietro is delayed, but I haven't gotten word today. Just one for the record. And we have the Planning Board here. We have Planning Board members.
Mrs. Ackley?
I'm here.
Mr. Reno? Ms. Belrose? Mr. Mushi? Mr. Loyne?
Here, present.
Mr. Spinelli?
Here.
Mr. Payer? We have 3 present.
Okay, thank you. So there's no quorum of the Planning Board. Tonight's special meeting is for one purpose only, and that is to have a presentation. It's the second draft of the zoning bylaw that has been being worked on for months and months now here in the town. We will have this presentation by Daphne Politis and Judy Barrett from Barrett Planning Group and Community Circle. And first we will have our Planning Director, Ken Comia, talk a little bit and let us know what's going to happen this evening. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Good evening, councilors and planning board members. Actually, Councilor Clements, you exactly summarized what I was going to say. So yes, as Councilor Clements mentioned, this is a presentation of the work that has been done up to date in regards to the zoning bylaw that we're currently working on. Ms. Politis will be speaking through a presentation and discussing some of the major things that have happened during this process. And we'll discuss the next steps as well. And I believe Judy Barrett will be joining us shortly. Right. So, Ms. Politis.
Thank you, Ken. Good evening, councilors. Good evening, Planning Board. So thank you for this opportunity to present to you. This is partway through the process, so we'd like to bring you up to date, let you know where we are, and ask you please to take a look at this in more detail after tonight and give us any feedback so we can incorporate it before moving forward and before doing a whole lot more work. And that includes if you had any questions, anything that you feel needs clarification, why we decided something. So please, thank you and give us your comments. So, I'd like to start by thanking this working group. They have been by far the most hard-working working group. They have spent many more hours than we assigned to the meeting each time, and they're really dedicated to understand what we're doing and to make it better for Southbridge. It's been really impressive, and the town should be proud of them. And I'd just like to add that there are 2 other people who have attended almost all the meetings and have shown additional dedication, and they are Sandy Ackley and Maureen Doyle. And somehow that, I don't know what happened to the font there and it moved over. Sorry about that. So, we're looking at the current bylaw. The current bylaw was adopted in 1985, amended through 2014, administered by the Planning Board, and enforced by the Building Inspector. Now, that's all very common throughout many communities. You start early on adopting a planning code, and then over time, it just gets adjusted, and it gets amended, and things get added to it. And so it doesn't always flow, and sometimes there are contradictions. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that it works for you. But we first want to just understand, well, what is zoning? It's really the major way you have to control what happens and where it happens, and sometimes to the degree that you can, what it looks like. And here's Judy. So it controls the future uses, the types of development, and the location of that development by identifying zones and what is allowed in those zones in terms of the types of uses and in terms of dimensional regulations. And it's really one of your most important tools. So that's why we'd like to sharpen it so you can help to shape your town. So the review focused mostly on making the improvement, first of all, clearer and easier to use. And as we've talked about before, that would only help to give people from the outside a support and kind of confidence in making an investment in your community. Consistent with goals that are articulated in various town plans that you spend a lot of time and money on, so we'd like to make it so that these tools can help you to implement those plans, and consistent with state law and best practice. So what key questions does this process answer? How can the zoning encourage the desired types of uses in desired locations? How can the bylaw streamline the review process? And how can it be made easier to use so that it's fair when you apply it, so it's clear for all, and so it doesn't leave too much room for interpretation, but just enough so that you can get what you want when you're working with a particular project or proposal. So how did we go about this? We began, actually here Judy Barrett, who's state expert on zoning, did the zoning diagnostic, which means looking at your existing zoning and figuring out what works about this and what could be better. And are there inconsistencies? Are there areas that could be updated in terms of best practice? Could there be more graphic representation that would make it clearer? And simultaneously, we conducted stakeholder interviews. We interviewed a whole bunch of people as to their experience using the bylaw, what worked for them, what didn't work for them. We had an all boards meeting in this very room and came up with the first reading draft, which was reviewed. And you'll see here this, all those to date, if we include tonight, that we've had 10 meetings with the working group. So going over all the details, actually, line by line. And now we've come up to the second draft, and we'll be incorporating the comments. We're in the process now. So a summary of the zoning diagnostic. What did Judy find when she looked at your current zoning and compared it to other zoning and best practices? What's positive about it? It's simplicity, so that makes it easy to access. The recent additions, for example, the solar bylaw, make it more modern, more up-to-date. Efforts at cleaning it up make it a good start at moving forward. And it's ready for technical and policy changes. So it was clear to see where those needed to happen. Areas that need improvement, the structure and format, for example, numbering and the organization. And this is not just Southbridge. I mean, this happens, as I said, when you've had a zoning bylaw over many years. It's just natural. So don't feel bad. Just feel good that you're doing this. Its access and ease of use, for example, having an index would help it so people could find their way around if they're looking for one particular thing, graphics, hyperlinks. Clarity and consistency, so word choices, using words that people from the outside that compare you to other towns, they recognize right away what it is that you're referring to. Missing topics, and those topics are missing because they weren't relevant when you first put this together. And again, it's about modernization. And land use policy. So for example, how do you deal with your downtown? What do you want to happen there? How do you want it to happen? And your reliance on special permits, your, shall I say, over-reliance on special permits. During the stakeholder interviews, people felt that the table of uses was very easy to use. That was a positive. The fact that it was available online and searchable, people really appreciated that. And that it did a good job of separating incompatible uses. Where did people feel there were areas for improvement? In the definitions section, some people felt that it wasn't clear that when they were talking about one thing and looking at that definition, someone else thought it meant something else. So that's immediately cause for trouble. That the zones needed to be reviewed and revised because things had changed over time and the zones hadn't been adapted or updated. Everyone agreed that the use of the special permit was too much. The review of regulations for the central core, and there was a lot of discussion about the need for that. And the industrial zone designations and the definitions were not specific enough so that those areas lay just the way they are because there weren't enough definitions guiding people to what uses you want there. And then the split lots that were found primarily around the downtown. So the first draft, this comment matrix, anyone on the working group will recognize. They were asked to go through line by line and comment and ask questions about all of the provisions that Judy proposed. We went over that in February 22nd. And so now just for some key highlights, try to keep it just to key highlights because there's a lot of detail here. We don't want to get lost in it. We want to first understand the goals. So what is this zoning bylaw intended to do? And then once we figure out what we agreed as what it was intended to do, then we figure out how to do it. So to promote the general welfare of the town. Now, that is something I don't think anyone would disagree with, and all zoning ordinances should aspire to that. To protect the health and safety of its inhabitants, the same. Conserve the value of land and buildings. Encourage an orderly expansion of the tax base. Support most appropriate use of land throughout the town. To further the goals and policies of the master plan. To preserve and increase amenities of the town consistent with state law. Okay, so how? First, it's about improving the ease of use. So how can, regardless of these policy decisions, regardless of these goals, how can this be used more easily? So the table of uses has been improved and definitions have made clearer. They've been moved to the end of the bylaw so then you can add additional definitions more easily and you can find it easily. And new definitions have been added. For example, senior housing, which it's been added because it's needed, because of your increasing senior population, and manufacturing versus industrial and what those uses are. And then changes were made to reflect best practice so that it could be recognizable to those, again, from the outside looking and saying, oh yeah, well, Southbridge is up to date, has a modern zoning bylaw. I understand how to use this. I understand what they want from me. So I feel like it's less of a risk approaching the town. So, some changes needed to be made in order to support the goals of the master plan, which if any of you were involved, and I know some of you in the room were, it entailed a very large public participation process. So a lot of people were asked what they wanted for the town, and then not to be able to do it because the zoning didn't allow it is not really a great answer to the people who were asked what they wanted. And as we've said before, Massachusetts doesn't require its municipalities to change the zoning to align with the master plan, although hopefully that will be changing in legislation, but it doesn't yet. And so it's up to each town to do it. And so we're very pleased that you are, and the citizens of your town should be too. So some of the changes that we made that were policy decisions that the working group agreed needed to happen in order to move forward with the zoning. To support downtown revitalization efforts. Now that was something that everyone agreed on in all the stakeholder interviews. The working group had no trouble agreeing on that. Promoting neighborhood improvements. And then it was about specific improvements and what could zoning do about that and what zoning couldn't do about that was a big discussion. Encouraging economic development by streamlining the process. I've referred to that a couple of times already. And supporting the development of gateways so that we've talked about how those can help to change the image of the town if they are on the edges of the town. What is the first impression? So these improvements can help to change the brand and the image of the town. And encouraging housing for the increasing senior population. So a little more specifically, the zones are in the process now of being revised. So there's a proposed expansion of the central core. And so the proposed expansion is, okay, so if the central core was, let's say, here, and business is located outside of it, well, wouldn't it just be more reasonable to just say that is the downtown area? So the working group came up with a proposed, and is working with the planning board on finalizing that definition of those boundaries. And also to change from the overlay district to a downtown district. The working group felt that changing the names of the residential districts from single family, two family, and multifamily would be easier to work with, so R1, R2, R3. And if any of you go to the second draft, that's not in there yet, but it was decided to be included. So as you can see, things are continually moving. Cleaning up of split lots. So that's especially with regard to the lots around the downtown area that found themselves, half in a residential district, half in a business district. And that really didn't make a lot of sense, especially when redevelopment was to occur. And then orphan lots. So we identified orphan lots throughout. Those were parcels that were found, small parcel, in a larger zone that didn't match up with that larger zone. So we talked about the overuse of the special permit. So one way that zoning can promote desirable uses in desired locations is to say in this particular zone, these are the uses that are allowed by right. So that was something we went through literally line by line. Dimensional requirements. So those were in many cases the same across the entire town. So we changed them to reflect the character of each zone, and particularly in the downtown, we changed them to encourage infill development and denser development because that's more in keeping with the character of a downtown. And then introducing a minor site plan review, making a minor change easier to accomplish, but still giving the town the right to review. A little more specific, just some samples. Allowing for health-related uses by right around the hospital areas so that could become more of a medical campus, if you will. Allowing agricultural-related uses in certain districts by right or by special permit in other areas to support local food production and consumption, among other goals. Provisions to encourage the redevelopment of the 5,000 square foot lots. Those are primarily in the center core. There was a lot of concern about that. What happens when one of those gets removed? How can those be redeveloped in a way that keeps the downtown knit but well kept? And addressing the eyesore of multiple cars on front lawns. So these are very specific, just samples that people were concerned about, that the provisions were put in place. And clear definitions regarding non-conforming uses and abandoned properties. And those are also still in process. So in case that's something you're very concerned about and go to draft 2, we just want you to know that they'll be even clearer. So, next steps. Incorporating all the comments to the second draft, compiling a memo of future uses. So there'll be some things you might be interested in that won't be here because it might be just too much for the town to take on right now, and also some things you're working on. For example, the stormwater regulations, marijuana cultivation, Airbnb regulations, they're still in flux. So we're keeping track of all the things people say they're interested in for you to address at a later date. Meeting with the town staff to go over the hearing draft review, a pre-hearing meeting with the town staff, and then the planning board hearing in the fall, and then adoption by the planning board and the town council. But the immediate next step is what I said in the beginning. Please read the revised draft 2. If you don't understand something, please ask. Ask it now before the hearing draft. If you have any comments, you see something's missing, or you feel like something isn't clear, please say so now. And there's the contact info. Please send all comments to Rosemary. There's her phone number, her email, and please do so by June 30th, so that by July 1st we can start working on the hearing draft. Any questions at this time?
Mr. Town Manager.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just a question, and I have the second draft in front of me, and there's no red line version, so I can't tell what's changed from what it was.
Of course.
How significant were the changes from the original zoning document with this document that we're on?
Oh, from your current, you mean?
Current zoning is
Okay, that's hard. Judy's going to have to answer that one.
It wasn't possible to do a red line to the first or second draft between your current zoning and this because the changes are pretty significant. A lot of them are structure and format, so you would have ended up with a document that had all kinds of red line. It just wouldn't have been readable. So I think the format and organization are different. So, where you have some things now, they're in places that are more intuitive, in my opinion, in the draft. Some of your non-conforming references in your current zoning are a little bit scattered. They're organized here. The definitions have been moved. The definitions have been updated. The site plan review process has been substantially updated. So there are quite a few changes. I think that many of the policy level changes really have to do with the updated use regulations and the district boundary changes. And Larry, I'm picking on you because you're over there and you've been involved in the working group, but that's my gut sense is that in terms of things that would be of interest to people, it's the boundary changes and the use regulations.
I think one other question. In terms of downtown, one of the issues is you have an old blighted building and it comes down and it's on a very small lot. And it makes it difficult sometimes to rework with that lot under existing zoning rules. Tell me a little bit about what you've done to deal with that specific issue so that we don't have holes in the downtown area. Because that seems to be a concern of a lot of us that we take down a business, an old business building, we get rid of it, and then we can't replace it, and there's this gap.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's been changed is that the dimensional regulations for the central core are being reduced to make it possible to work with very small properties. But I also think the non-conforming uses and structures section that's in this draft is actually going to be more helpful to you because if you have a property that's non-conforming now and it goes through the lapse period under state law, there is a way here for that property to be resuscitated, if you will, through a special permit process, so you haven't lost the property entirely. And I think that those kind of two pieces together, plus just the updated use regulations, plus the ability to say, if you have a non-conforming use now, use and structure are different, but if you have a non-conforming use now and you want to change it to another use, some bylaws and ordinances say you can only go to a conforming use. Some say that you could go to something that's still non-conforming but is more conforming and is less detrimental to the neighborhood, and that's kind of the approach we've tried to take here so that there's some flexibility for the town to work with those property owners.
Okay, so my last question is, you describe this process as bringing up to a more up-to-date zoning plan, but also comparable to new zoning plans in other communities, more modern, I guess is the word I think I heard you say. At the end of this process, where will we be compared to other towns in terms of a modern update to a reasonable zoning regs?
Well, I think in terms of the structure, the format, the language, that it's going to be a more recognizable document. There's a vocabulary to zoning. This vocabulary changes. We've tried to kind of bring some of that into 2018 terms so that a proponent coming in from outside of town who might have worked in another community looking at your bylaws is probably going to be able to find things a little easier and understand and know where and look for terminology that's there. I think that when we finish, there will probably be some additional things the town will want to talk about that people don't really feel ready to discuss right now. That's good, actually, because I think the best way to keep a zoning bylaw current and consistent with law and just a living document is to have things you're working on. So when we get to the end of this process, we'll have sort of a next steps memo and some things, uses like accessory apartments, which people don't really feel comfortable dealing with right now. We'll provide some recommendations on perhaps how to think about that in the future.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
I just want to piggyback one thing before I recognize the next counselor. Because the non-conforming lots and that type of situation, the abandoned type lots, was something that when I sat in on, that you guys were discussing. So, and I see in the section of 6.5, there is a D one that just, the one statement still bothers me a little because it says, any non-conforming use that has either been abandoned or that has not been used for 2 years or more shall lose the protections accordance under this bylaw and shall be required to conform to the current bylaw. But then you just said that there may be something to resurrect something that was non-conforming. So I guess I still get a little concerned because sometimes 2 years is still not enough to, I mean, sometimes something's abandoned, someone comes back in, and now you're saying if that lot still doesn't meet, then how do we ever do anything with it if there's no...
6.5C provides for the planning board to, by special permit, allow that property to come back, if you will.
Okay, so even though you've got a D, which pretty much says the 2 years, the C then still allows the potential.
It loses its protections.
Right.
But then there's this other process that might allow it to come back.
Yeah, it's just
but
a
I
little
do
more.
agree. We actually talked about this the other day. The arrangement of C and D is a little bit confusing. So in the third draft, we'll address that. But C is really the thing I guess I want you to focus on because that's, I think, the most significant part of this section.
Right.
So thank you.
Okay, no, that was one of the big, I know for me personally, just knowing the sizes of lots and we have all these open spaces that you would think somebody might be able to put something in and you can't because it doesn't work. And how's that help us economically? So I love that that's all being addressed. That's certainly, I think, one of the biggest benefits of this is all those empty spots might be able to be sold off. Town taking lots that we've demolished buildings on and be able to build a single family or build something that we might not have been able to. Yep. Councillor Manna, thank you so much, Councillor Manna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. Just a question. How will the changes affect the current businesses, locations, anything that's right now? How will these changes affect? Will it have a significant impact on anything?
Well, the significant impact is the effective date of the bylaw, which would be when it's adopted. So, I mean, that's the thing that you really have to focus on. And there are actually some blank dates in here right now that we're leaving blank because we're not quite sure yet when that, when the hearing to adopt will take place. But something that already exists now has grandfathering rights under Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act. It happens to be Section 6 of the Zoning Act, and Section 6 of your bylaw is where all the protections for non-conforming uses and structures can be found. So if you exist today, you can continue to exist. If you are a single-family or two-family home, you can make quite a few changes to your residence without a lot of hassle. If you're some other type of use, then you still can extend or alter what you have, but you need to go through a process with the Board of Appeals to demonstrate that what you want to do isn't more detrimental to your neighbors than the existing condition. And that's actually state law.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilor Clare?
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you. That was actually part of my question too. The other part that I had as far as enforcement of existing properties, say specifically abandoned use. It looks like you have a provision for time as far as in the new bylaws, but for existing, abandoned uses or changing of use that we have, is that clock going to restart or?
Once this is in place, then someone who has a so-called abandoned property that may have lost its rights really becomes able to access this process that doesn't exist now.
Right, but so if I own, property number 1 and it's been, abandoned for a year, currently, you'd still have another year to continue the old use before it was considered abandoned. Is that 2 years still applicable in here?
Yes.
Or is it restarting over with the new bylaw change?
No, it would be 2 years from the quote date of abandonment.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Spinelli?
I'm trying to phrase this properly, but I think what people are missing here a little bit is, I hear a lot of questions about abandoned use, and having sat on the planning board for so many years, there has always been, to some extent, an ability to reinvigorate an abandoned use. It's just that for some reason, it kind of irks me a little bit, that there seems to be this thought that says, well, it's a very burdensome, it's difficult, it's whatever. And that really, I don't know, after 36 years on the board, I just don't see that as something that's viable. And so during these discussions, I've often joked with Judy and Daphne about this, but we have this process. The problem to me is not, I mean, we're modernizing it, we're making it better, there's no doubt about that, and I'm in full agreement with that. But there seems to be the impression that we've never allowed anything to go forward in the past, and that's not the truth. The truth of the matter is that even now, if you're abandoned for over 2 years, you're going to need a special permit. So you're going to come in front of the planning board and seek a special permit. So the planning board just doesn't look and say, oh, this. The planning board looks at everything, looks at lighting, location, use, traffic, how is it going to affect this and that. But I don't believe the planning board has ever refused for anything to be done in the downtown area, has ever refused a special permit for abandonment or anything else. So this is a tremendous document. It's well needed because when you start using these things like the planning board does all the time, you sometimes lose sight of what you need to do for the future. Because you're so involved in what you're trying to do now, to make things better now, to understand what's going on now, that, it takes a long time to do this. Thank God that the town council saw fit to hire professionals, and so this has been a process that's been rapidly sped up, and 99.9% of the time I enjoy the process. Once in a while I get but anyway, we have had a lot of, I meander, it's the Italian in me, but we have had the process. This makes it a little more expeditious, a little more clear as to the understanding, but it's always been there, and it's always, the town of Southbridge, I think, is very fortunate that the people that have been appointed to the planning board, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but very conscientious people. So, enough, I've said enough. I ramble.
I'll let Mr. Lang go first from planning board.
Actually, I just like to add just a little bit. Being my former life, I dealt with numerous towns around the state in zoning bylaws. This process that Southbridge has gone through puts us, the bylaw itself, in a great position for developers or people wanting to come to the town. A lot of times in the Southbridge's old bylaw, there was a lot of gray areas, a lot of conflicting areas, a lot of wording issues, and that's from numerous additions through the years. When I read through this bylaw and what I've seen with the wording, it's very consistent with a lot of the municipalities throughout the state. That the format is similar. So when a developer comes in, I've been working with developers in the past. You look at what's the table of uses. Is it allowed in a zone? Is it, what are the requirements for that zone? And this bylaw spells it out. And it takes a lot of the questions away of, oh, maybe it's not shown here, so maybe they're not going to allow it or stuff like that. No, it's in writing. You know what? It says right here, it's allowed under special permit. And with the special permit process, it gives the planning board the flexibility. That's the best part of the whole special permit process. The flexibility to, number one, look at the specific use, look at the neighborhood that it's being proposed in, and also the impacts on the municipalities, schools, water, utilities, traffic. So it gives an ability to review each one as an individual. And I think that's a real good step for the town to move forward in the process for zoning.
Thank you. So I want to kind of follow up on your comments, because I'll try to use an example. There's a house that the town took through foreclosure right across from the hospital. And, you know, it's lost its 2-year exemption because it hasn't been used for 2 years. And a developer might want to buy, and I'm talking specific developers who have talked to me, they might want to buy the property to rehabilitate the property. They feel because it's lost its 2 years grandfather, that it's going to be a nightmare to kind of go through the process to get to rehabilitate that building. So, I mean, I guess that I'm trying to think of how this would work. You're saying that if they came to you for a special permit, it might get approved to rehabilitate that existing building instead of us having to pay to rip it down, which is what I don't like. So that's possible. Is it a complex process? Because developers seem to think that it is, and that's what I'm trying to understand.
Well, you know, after so many years, I don't see it as a complex process at all. Maybe I have blinders on or something else, but I don't, you know, you come in, you have to do an initial presentation, you come in with your plans, the board looks at them, the board will make some comments as to what they see, what they don't see, what they think they might like. You send them back, you schedule a special permit formal application. You go through the thing. It can last one meeting if it's very clear, very precise, and well done, or it can last a number of meetings if it's not very clear or whatever, and then it's either approved or disapproved. So I don't see it as a difficult process at all.
When you say a plan, is that an architectural plan, or that could be as simple as explaining to you how they're going to rehabilitate the building? What is it a developer would need for that process? Because I get the sense from them that it's just not worth the investment of the architectural plan or whatever it is they have to do. I think there's state requirement for what they call a Chapter 34 review or whatever the name of that. It just seems like they're buying obviously property that's pretty run down if it's a foreclosure, right? And they're saying, you know, I'm going to invest a lot of money to bring it back to norm, but the downside is they have to go through this whole process that is, you know, encumbering and expensive, and that seems to be what I hear from developers. Therefore, the town ends up having to rip down the building because they won't make that investment. So,
can I respond to? I've been in the business for 30 years, and I think that developers have sometimes conflicting desires. One is predictability and speed, and the other is flexibility. And to try to accommodate both of those in one permitting process is very difficult. Mm-hmm. I do think that what might be helpful to the board and to applicants, when we finish the zoning revision, there's one more step in this process, and that is to prepare administrative rules and procedures for the planning board and for the Board of Appeals. Because the Board of Appeals' role is going to shift a little bit under this proposed bylaw. And so as part of preparing those regulations, we're also going to prepare all of the application forms. So the application form should tell people, this is exactly what you need to submit in order to qualify for a special permit under this section of the bylaw. And I'm not going to say the planning board hasn't been clear about that or the staff. I'm just saying that sometimes, no matter how much you explain, when the applicant takes the package home and they start thinking about what they have to do, if it's not written down clearly, they forget and then they get flustered. So I think that administrative piece of this, coupled with the zoning update, is probably going to be helpful to all of your local officials. It certainly is true that a special permit can be more involved, but the reality is that you all have to have some rules. And there's some threshold, and it varies from town to town, when someone can't quite meet all the rules, and then you either say no, or you provide a flexible process to negotiate something. And I think what you try to do in cases like your downtown is to limit the number of situations where someone has to get into a negotiated process, but when they need it, it's there, and that it's clear to everybody. I think that's kind of the rest of this you haven't even seen yet
To
from us.
understand the problem for the town, so to speak, is we're selling the property to foreclosure auction.
Yep.
And what we'd almost have to do is give them a right to, go away from the sale if they don't get the special site approval, right? So that's very difficult to do when you're trying to sell the property at a tax auction. So I agree with you that setting up a process that developers could very easily see, a standard process with explanation would be a good thing. I'm not sure that's going to fix our foreclosure issue and how to turn those properties. That's what I'm, just giving you the real world problem.
Right.
I'm not sure what the solution is, to be honest with you.
That's helpful to let us think about that a little more, because there may be a better way to address that. Let me think about it.
Okay. Thank you.
Would it be possible to do some sort of pre-evaluation on stuff like that, that comes from the town?
Yes,
In other words,
Denise,
we know
that's
the town
exactly
is
where I'm
selling it.
going.
And so the town could get the planning board involved to take kind of a pre-process to get some idea. And when you sell it, you're kind of clear that we see that there's value in doing
Yes.
whatever, we don't, you could kind of point out the things, and whoever buys would have at least an inkling. And I think
Yes.
that but I'm sure Mr. Loyne maybe was going to say that, I don't know.
Yeah, very similar to what I was going to say. And it also depends on what the developer is looking to redevelop. If they're taking like the house and they're going to put a low impact, very few cars and stuff like that, and it's very similar to the existing characteristics of the neighborhood, yeah, then it would be, they don't have to go through the extreme architectural plans and stuff. They can do a sketch with showing the parking spaces and the landscaping and so forth on a sort of a sketch. But if it's tearing down a multi-story building and putting in an extra 10 apartments, now you're talking full site plan, full utility impact, full site plan. So I think that's where the flexibility of the planning board with the minor and major site plan, special permit site plan procedures is going to make a big difference.
The procedure issue, I think, is a great one to develop that, so that at least developers could see right away what that process is. I think that's critical.
I think being proactive versus reactive on something like you're describing would be very beneficial to this community. So if the planning board, that's something to have a discussion about and find out how proactive on those types of properties that we know we don't get rid of that many, but it would be nice to, kind of get some insight from planning board on what they see going forward, so that a potential buyer is really excited now. Look, they're already on board. They're already looking at this. They've already got, that's going to drive development. So personally, I think that's something you should be working towards a future.
One.
Oh, go ahead. You finish and then.
Just to finish one more thing. On the town manager, you had mentioned the 34 review and stuff like that. That is cumbersome process, but it's not it's not required by the planning board. That's a building department and a state building code process. There's not a lot of getting around it, especially when you're doing a change of use. If you're doing something similar, residential and staying residential, you can get around it. There's ways of waivering it and so forth. But when you do a change of use and you're going sort of from a residential to a commercial structure, state building code is really tough on that. And I agree with you. It's a cumbersome process. It's made for large buildings, but it's been interpreted to small. And that's something that the state's going to have to look at, I think.
Well, just before we leave the subject, I understand why contractors would find developing plans to be cumbersome because they're also very expensive. But at the same time, Mike is right, it's state law. But also, this is our town, and we want to protect it, and we want to protect the people who might move into that building, work in that building, purchase a pair of socks in that building. So sometimes it's the nature of the beast. And it's a fine line and it's a balance.
When developers tend to want to get it as cheaply as possible, it's a nature of the business. most of the time, if you're developing a piece of property, you're already expecting on spending a little bit of money for a site plan or a building plan or an architectural plan. A lot of times they're going to cry, I can't afford it, but it's because they don't want to pay for it. I've been on that side of the fence many times.
And just to go along with that, one quick thought. Many's the time the planning board has waived the full document, drawn up architectural plans and gone with a thing. And I myself have been bitten in the you-know-what by somebody coming in with a hand-drawn plan. You grant them the special permit, and then all of a sudden it's not accomplished the way that it was presented to you, and now you're sitting at this board and you're frustrated with yourself because you made an effort to try and protect the town, and you drive by this location every day and you see what has not happened. It's a very frustrating thing. So although I understand a developer and where they're coming from, I take the opposite point of view and try to say, well, okay, I've been appointed to this planning board. It's my responsibility to look out for the town. I'm going to try to do my best. This new zoning is certainly a wonderful tool, and it certainly helps it. But you still need people on there who have a memory that goes back and says, okay, this is good, this is fine, but how do we hold these people to what they say and what they present? Because that's the real key. It's not the glorified plan that they present to you and they sell you a bill of goods. It's the actuality that what happens afterwards. And the town is left with whatever happens afterwards. And, you know, I've had people call me up and say, what the heck did you do? And I say, ugh. So I think it's important, and I think what we're doing here is a tremendous value, but I think people also have to be cognizant and realize that these boards, although they're voluntary, they do serve, and I'm not being defensive, I'm just saying, they serve a purpose. They really do. I know I can say for every member of the planning board, every member of the zoning, the ZBA, that, you know, we try to do what is best. Hopefully we're much more successful than our failures, but boy, we certainly remember our failures, and we try to go on from there.
It's only human. It's only human.
Enough said.
To Mr. Spinelli, the only thing I would say is, whether it's handwritten or architecturally done, you have copies, you hold them their feet to the fire. If what they presented to you on paper is there, then you need to do your job and hold them to the fire. Whether, you know, if it doesn't get done in 2 years, they get fined. Whatever the rules are, when they don't complete what they've presented, it doesn't matter what it is. I could write it on a napkin and say, I'm building a 3-story building with a tree right here. And
enforcement is another thing,
yeah.
and that's
Well, the
that's a
enforcement, I
tough
think, is
thing
very
to do.
important, because if we're not enforcing what you got, if you are not enforcing what you've put on the paper for these people to do, then that's a problem we have. So tell us how we can help you with
And
that.
I'm not throwing stones at current people at all. I'm just saying enforcement is a very, very difficult thing, even for minor things. For example, a chicken bylaw. You know, everybody says, oh, what a pain in the butt that is. But, you know, if you pass this, you create the opportunity for people to do this with under state law acreage and everything else. You hold them responsible for it, and if they don't do it, you know, you want something done, because you can't let every Tom, Dick, and Harry come over and run amok in the town either. That's not right. That's not fair to all the other taxpayers who are responsible, who live up to their responsibility, pay their taxes on time, and do everything else. It's not a right thing. So this goes a long way to helping us out.
So to respond to that, Larry, and you know that on a number of occasions we've assigned lawyers to your group to defend your, to me, the integrity of the positions you've taken. And I think it's extremely important that when you guys take a position and developers don't live up to it, then if we have to get attorneys involved to force them to, I think that's critical. And I suggest to your board that on the number of occasions you've asked for it, you've always gotten the attorneys. So I just want to let you know that when those occasions when you need it and you feel like somebody is not living up to the commitment they made, you will have the full support of town legal counsel to back you to make sure you have credibility. Because if you lose that credibility, it's the end of it. I mean, once you start losing that credibility, people will walk all over you guys. So I respect that and will do everything I can to support that, just so you understand.
Other questions? Councillor Steves.
Yeah, I had one actually. Somebody called me this afternoon and wanted to raise an issue that I've kind of brought up the issues of agriculture a couple of times on this and on our subcommittee meetings. And somebody called me this afternoon and asked if we could throw something in there about making sure we can protect potentially highly productive agricultural lands, as making them some way to make them exempt from development. I don't know what the law says about that.
Well, you can't take away development rights entirely. I mean, the ultimate cure, you're not going to like my answer, but if there's some property that you really care about because it has excellent agricultural soils, someone owns that property and really has a right to expect to be able to get value out of it. If you're trying to protect it, the way you protect it is to own it. But you can't, through zoning, just take away those development rights. You could certainly encourage in areas like that the use of tools like open space residential development and try to save as much of the site as you can for purposes other than home construction.
Could we incorporate things like conservation restrictions and things like that, or some encouragements to do those kinds of things into zoning?
Well, in the bylaw, I think actually your current bylaw says this too, but you can't, the planning board and the applicant, there's this point when you say, here's the plan we're going to do, and this is where the open space is. And the open space, it gets protected in one of three ways. It either gets deeded to the town under the stewardship of the Conservation Commission. There's a homeowners association. There's a CR that gets held by a land trust or something. So, I mean, the law kind of requires that. There's some disposition of that open space, so it, it doesn't just end up becoming a problem later. But there is certainly a way to help protect it under state law, and that's just simply, copied into the zoning. It's almost verbatim, follows the state law.
Are there any ways we can use the zoning to kind of gently nudge people in that direction as opposed to developing them?
Pardon me, Gus?
Is there any way we can kind of use zoning to gently nudge people in the direction of conservation rather than development?
Well, the way this bylaw is written, the default requirement is an open space residential design.
Okay.
And one could say, well, I don't want to do this, and apply for a special permit to get relief from the open space design, which is kind of different from the way a lot of these bylaws have been written in the past. This assumes that you want to save open space in areas where there's still vacant land. But one always has the ability to go to the planning board and say, just because of the way the shape of this site is shaped or the slope or something on it, this open space design doesn't really work. I want to apply for a special permit and ask to be relieved from the requirement. And it's up to the planning board to decide whether to grant that.
Right.
So you have to give them a relief valve, if you will, but the default assumption here is that you're trying to save open space.
Good. At the moment, yeah. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay. Well then, thank you so much for doing this update. I just want to remind council going forward that it will be a council decision down the road. So it's behooves you to be invested and to read and as they say, present your comments and such, because this is policy, and policy is under the next council's, this council and those who come after. And so you need to take this seriously. It affects all the people and the businesses, the residential, our way of life here in Southbridge. So I hope that you will take the time to read through and make highlights and come back with some information. Councillor Nash, if you're in.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for you. I will take a quick moment just to make note that I did appreciate being part of the focus groups early on, and some of my remarks were incorporated. I want to extend my compliments and my gratitude to those that have been involved with you. I know that Councillor Steves and Councillor Clements have been involved to some extent. I'm grateful for their participation as well. This is a very easy to hold, manage, review, read document. The font is very consistent. These are simple little things to a lot of folks, but this is a very appealing format. What's more, I'm very, very happy to see that the definitions are incorporated. While I had suggested to put them at the front, they're complete for what we have now, and that's something that means a lot to me. So I'm very, very pleased with what I've seen. I did take the time to review this. Thank you all so very much, and I'm very grateful for the participation of the community and the planning board. Thank you.
Mr. Spinelli?
I just want to add one very simple thing. When people read this document, you can't just read one paragraph and make that paragraph stand out and say, what are these people thinking about? When you read this document, well, I mean, during our working sessions, we've had to tear these apart, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. But you have to take into the totality of each section and realize what is being said, because if you don't, you can read something and it's 180 degrees from what is being written when you take in the whole section and the meaning that is being developed there. If you, and you know, you can do that with great literature. You take a sentence out of context and the whole thing loses its text. But if you put it back in now, you say, oh, that person didn't say that. Shakespeare didn't say that. He said this. So I just, because I've been guilty of that a couple of times where I've read a sentence and then I've had to have Judy or Daphne take me back and say, Larry, read the whole paragraph. And all of a sudden I go, oops. And so it's very, very important that, you know, don't take things out of their context. Read it all the way through. And then if you have a question, ask the question, but try to understand the whole section when we're talking about, you know, especially like abandoned use and some of those. You have to read everything and then digest it all and then take a look at it, because nitpicking it to death, you're going to miss the whole concept that's there. And, you know, these wonderful people who have been doing this work, and then the volunteers who have served, and Gus can tell you that, you know, we've made some very tactical mistakes when we've tried to take something apart or take it out of context, and then when we put it back into its context, boy, does it make sense. So I just want people to understand that, you know, it's the old English teacher in me that would say, you know, read the whole thing.
We couldn't have said it better ourselves.
Maybe shorter, though, yes?
And being compared to Shakespeare, how's that, Judy?
No offense taken, right?
None.
Perfect. Councillor Manna.
I do have one question. Section 7.2.4 for noise. I really like that there's, you know, this is in here. However, what if there's an emergency and there needs to be construction done during the hours that the noise pollution control and or on a Sunday or on a holiday? Would they have to like call anybody for a special permit, or is it because it's an emergency they wouldn't have to do any such thing? And what would constitute an emergency?
I'm having a little trouble hearing over here, but are you asking about the noise section?
Yes,
We're actually
7.2.4. What if there's, you have,
We're actually
what's-
recommending that that be moved into the general bylaws and out of zoning, because it's not really a zoning issue. And so, but your question is a good one. It's sort of what constitutes an offensive noise. And it's a very difficult issue. Every town wrestles with this. It really comes down to, is it bothering someone enough that they complain? I'm very serious. It's like you can say it can't emit a noise beyond the property line. I mean, those are typically things that you would say. But no one in your town, in any town I've ever worked in, is going to have someone out sort of policing noise. So it really does come down to a sort of complaint-driven system. And you don't want it in zoning, because zoning involves a grandfathering. So if there's some activity taking place now that's noise generating, they're kind of protected under zoning. But if the noise ordinance is somewhere else, then you have a separate enforcement remedy.
And we do councilman in our regular bylaws, there is noise.
no, I know, because
Right.
I saw this in here and I thought, you know, oh, construction, you know, oh, yeah, no, I don't like being woken up at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, you know what I mean, by something loud, not even a lawnmower.
Yeah.
So, I was just curious. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, other questions, comments? Oh, seeing none, then, oh, wait, another one.
I just wanted to make a just kind of quick.
He can't get enough.
What's that again? Yeah.
Said you can't get enough
I
working
guess not.
group here.
I just wanted to get people's attention back for a second to the comment period, the fact that we're looking for comments by June 30th on this particular draft. And the draft and most of the previous documentation is on the town website. It is, I think it is, isn't it? I'm pretty sure it is.
I don't know.
I think it is.
That's
Is
staff.
this document online? That's my...
Yes, if you go to the Economic Development and Planning page, there is a section called Zoning Bylaw Update, and it's in there, and those documents are posted.
I thought I looked at it there, but I don't normally look at it because I've got it all in text. So, so just for people who are interested, please take a chance to look at that. It's out there. If you have any interest, you can obviously contact Rosemary with comments. You can contact Larry. He's on the committee. I'm on the committee. Sandy's on the committee for the ones that are up here. And anybody else who's on the committee, and certainly let us know what the concerns are, and we can bring them up at our subcommittee at our zoning bylaw update meetings and hash them out and figure out where we're going to go with them. So.
Right. Might I ask, though, Mr. Cummey, you say it's under the Economic Development tab, that's great, but for the average person who might just go to the town website, I know that sometimes we have stuff on the front that can link us to something else, and maybe at this point with the comment period coming
Sure.
and all that, we should have something a little more, urgent in
Yes,
some
yes,
sort
we
of
can
manner.
put that on the front page.
Instead of some of the older stuff that sometimes
For sure.
is still there.
And user-friendly, right?
Right.
Anyone else? Okay. Anyone else? Every time I turn my head, somebody raises a hand. So. All right, so seeing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
All in favor? Okay, it's unanimous by all present. Thank you.